Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar explaining the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. I'd like to get started tonight. My name is Josh Craycraft and I'm one of the program directors at Primary Source. I'll be moderating this evening's discussion. I'm very pleased to add that we'll be recording tonight's webinar so that others who are unable to join us live can still benefit from the discussion. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone's audio is working properly. To participate tonight, please run the audio setup wizard, which can be found in the top left corner of your screen as per the instructions that you see. It's really important that you run this. For those of you who are new to Primary Source, we are a nonprofit organization in the Boston area that seeks to advance global learning in K-12 schools. We do this in part by offering online and face-to-face professional development courses to teachers, and by hosting webinars such as this one, which are meant to offer knowledge, tools, and strategies for teaching global matters of pressing importance. As many of you know, we've run several webinars this calendar year on issues pertaining specifically to the Middle East, but Primary Source also provides professional development opportunities and resources for teaching U.S., Latin American, African, and Asian history, societies, and cultures. Tonight, of course, we'll be talking about the refugee crisis and how to discuss it with students. Let me say a few words about format first. We're joined by not one but two experts on the Middle East, and both will have the opportunity to speak with you shortly. After they've shared their thoughts, we'll move on to the Q&A portion. To ask a question, simply type it in the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. Please note that the speakers and I will be able to view what you write in any of the chat boxes, whether they're meant to be public posts or private messages sent to other participants. We do anticipate lots of questions tonight, and we will try to work through all of them as best we can. And finally, while we know that there's much to discuss about the modern Middle East, we ask that your questions tonight remain focused on the issue of migration. As I said, we're very fortunate that two experts are with us this evening. Our first speaker will be Dr. Noora, a professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Professor Lori is a Johns Hopkins trained political scientist and an expert on migration in the Middle East. She also recently received the Gittner Family Prize for Faculty Excellence last May, so special congratulations are in order there. She also just told me that she loves being around history and historians, so she's in good company. After we hear from Professor Lori, we'll also hear from Barbara Petzen of Middle East Connections, who will share with you some key points and resources for talking about what's going on in the region with your students. Barbara is a Rhodes Scholar who did her graduate work at Oxford and Harvard, and she specializes in helping educators better understand and teach about the Middle East. She's also a longtime friend of Primary Source, and we're happy to have her back with us tonight, participating from New Orleans, where she's at the NCSS conference. So, without further delay, I'd like to begin. Professor Lori, please feel free to start when you're ready.
Wonderful. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and also for all of you coming out. I know many of you are teachers and have had long days and lesson plans and homework to do, so for me it's really exciting to get to talk to you about this. And actually what I'd like to do today is, rather than go into the depth, try to give you the best kind of introductory overview that I can of the larger issues. So starting from the top, what is the current refugee crisis? How do we measure this problem? What are some key terms? How do we define the scope of this crisis? Second, why is this crisis happening now? So what's different about this year? Why do we suddenly see this explosion of news and public attention to this issue? Because those of us who've been paying attention have known that this crisis is actually much older, and it's been a very unsustainable situation for several years. So why is it that now people are paying attention? Finally, I'm going to look a little bit at the impact of the crisis on receiving regions and Europe, less in kind of the deeper cultural impact, which we can talk about in the Q&A, but more in just the immediate how many people are being absorbed and by whom. Then I'll move on very quickly to look at one of the main sending countries and talk about the immediate causes and long-term pressures. And then as a way of, by conclusion, I'm going to make an argument that there's a much deeper structural crisis in the structure of the international refugee regime system. So finally, I'll end with some lesson plans and resources, and basically some easy databases that you can plug into and get recent data, because it is an evolving situation, and especially when we're counting people who move, all of the figures are very charged and difficult to kind of quantify. So the scope of the problem, some key terms. First of all, in the media you always hear refugees, but we actually have to differentiate between how we use refugees colloquially and the legal category of refugees as a protected status. So first of all, many of the people that we actually call refugees don't have refugee status. They're technically displaced persons. And displaced persons can encompass a whole range of people. It basically means a person forced to leave their home, a person whose residency does not match up to their citizenship. We see that includes refugees, who a refugee is a status given by international law. We'll talk about that a little bit. This includes asylum seekers, and when you see the term asylum, we're always talking about domestic law. So that depends on each country. Then we also include internally displaced persons. So this is a huge figure that doesn't go into the refugee stats, but it's people who are displaced within their own borders. And finally, you have returned refugees requiring protection. And this is a bit more difficult to think about, but the same international institutions that protect refugees also protect them when they go back and to their sending countries and try to reclaim property and try to rebuild their lives. Finally, the UNHCR, which is the main international body that protects refugees, also has this category of others of concern. And this others of concern is basically the catch-all category that refers to most of the people that we're talking about. But it's not very powerful to say an others of concern crisis. So refugees as a kind of, even for political and normative reasons, people use that term, even when we're talking about populations that are not actually protected. They don't have the privileges of the refugee status. So what is a refugee status? Effectively, it's not just you will be killed if you stay in that place. It's not just being in a war zone. It's not starvation. It's not having no options in your life. It only protects people who can show that the reason they're going through those hardships are because they have been targeted and persecuted because of their identity. So for reasons of race, for reasons of religion, political opinion, nationality, sexuality, membership in a particular group falls into, is the larger catch-all that can extend to protecting people for their sexual preferences. So the reason that the definition of the refugee is defined in this way is because it comes out of World War II and was an international response to what was seen as a really massive crisis in the international system, because the entire system is based on this idea that states protect their own citizens. So what do you do when a state does the exact opposite and systematically persecutes its own citizens? And so all of the legal framework was about protecting people who were persecuted for that specific identity. And in that sense, it's a political issue and not, for example, an economic issue. So economic migrants are not refugees. You have to actually be persecuted for who you are. And when you work with refugee lawyers and individuals, you realize this is an extremely onerous process. You have to show so much you have to show so much evidence that you've been through targeted persecution, that it was specific to your identity, and that and actually that your stories, for example, align with your physical wounds. So there's lots of different parts of kind of checking whether people can get the status, and that's why it's actually a very, very few, a much smaller number of this global problem who get to have this refugee status. So the bottom line is that we have two meanings, the legal category of protection versus the way refugees are used by NGOs and the media. And if we think about displaced people, we've seen unprecedented levels of displacement in world history. We're at close to 60 million people who are displaced, and that includes all of those categories from the previous slide. So internally displaced, people who are recognized as refugees. But again, the number of refugees is so much smaller than the number of displaced. And actually, you can tell even with the Syrian crisis, for example, 40 million are considered refugees by the UNHCR, but the displaced is oh, excuse me, I actually want to change that figure because it's published, when you look up UNHCR sources, it'll often say Syrian refugees, but when you read the fine print of how they collect this data, these Syrians are persons of concern. They don't have the refugee status. There are Syrians who get the refugee status, but it is really much more difficult to get that status and be resettled by the UNHCR. And for most of the people that we're talking about, the UNHCR is basically providing humanitarian assistance, but not resettling them. So the people who actually get to be resettled from the Syrian crisis is way less than 4 million. The numbers that we have of sort of others of concern is closer to 4 million, and then displaced figures range from like 9 million to 16 because it's just so difficult to measure that. And I also want to say that these numbers are extremely politically charged and are, at best, estimates. People, again, who move are very difficult to count. And often when it comes to the questions of migration, the language, the way you talk about the category of the person becomes very important, because you could have two people traveling for very similar reasons, being economically motivated, but if one person has a passport that allows them to reside in that country as a tourist, or they can travel freely. If someone has a passport that requires them to have a visa to go to each and every node in a much larger travel system, they become illegal in each and every one of those nodes. So certain nationalities have much easier global mobility than others. Whether you call someone a migrant, illegal migrant, a refugee, has a huge impact on their access to protection and legal rights and citizenship rights. So I mentioned this UN agency and the fact that the UN agency that was designed to protect refugees came out of World War II. I think the bottom line is that even though the legal framework doesn't extend refugee status to all of the people that we consider to be sort of facing conditions we would expect to get refugee status, it has expanded to provide humanitarian assistance. So, but humanitarian assistance does not equal the legal protection status. And that's when I was mentioning that Syrian figure of 4 million, those are people who are receiving humanitarian assistance from the UNHCR. They do not have legal protection as the refugee status. The UNHCR essentially has about 3 key functions. The first is the protection of refugees, the second is assistance, and then really their functions are entirely determined by their partnerships with states. And you have to be party to the convention. They don't just have relationships with states who are parties of the 1951 convention. It's actually few states, there aren't that many states who are. And we know that a lot of refugees live in countries that aren't party to the convention. For example, Afghani refugees have been in Pakistan and Iran for many, many decades. So they essentially receive refugees, but they're not bound to that convention, and they don't actually officially use it. Finally, moving on, so now that we have a sense of who's a refugee and who's not, why are we now hearing about this? Well, in this September, the news media kind of exploded, or social media, excuse me, exploded after a Turkish journalist took a picture of a 3-year-old boy whose body was washed up on the shores in Europe. And he was Syrian, and his family was trying to go to Canada, so it actually created some political debates in Canada. And really, I think that I'm not showing the most graphic photo, so there is the photo that was circulated just really showed the little boy, and I think that, you know, you can show a number like 60 million and it doesn't really move people, but you show a little boy who's helpless and washed up on the shores of Europe, this developed modern part of the world, and it becomes much bigger, and it enters the public imagination much more. And you know, so and why now? Why now is because it went to Europe. The refugee crisis was a crisis. It's been a crisis for Turkey, for Lebanon, for Jordan, for Egypt. There's no question this has been unsustainable. First with Iraq, and now with the Syrians, it's been a huge crisis for a long time. But this is the first year that we've seen huge surges in the numbers of people who are going to Europe. Secondly, why do we see so many people go to Europe? The build-up over the past 5 years since the beginning of the Syrian civil war has meant that people who have been in the immediate receiving region have either become so kind of destitute and desperate that they take these huge risks of, you know, climbing into a refrigerated van or getting onto a boat and going to a new place because there's absolutely no more opportunity in a place like Jordan. And in fact, in Jordan in particular, some people are actually going back to Syria because the country can't absorb that many people. It's just a kind of scarcity issue. So people are leaving, taking really risky routes because they have fewer options, or people were working for a few years in the immediate receiving region, saving to travel. And then you have the escalation of the crisis between ISIS and now airstrikes and the Russians. You keep pushing people out. So there's no room for reconstruction, and you're just kind of increasing these flows out. And so this creates a huge surge, actually, in the numbers of people who are reaching Europe. I'm trying to see if I can have this exact figure somewhere. Yeah, so just to give you an idea, in 2013, the number, by the same source, so the number of sort of irregular migrants between January and October of 2013 was about 60,000 reaching European shores. Of course, all these figures are just quotes to verify their estimates at best. 60,000 in 2013. In 2014, for that same period, January to October, sea arrivals from irregular migrants spiked to 165,000. So huge spike in 1 year. By 2015, in that exact same period, January to October, we're looking at 1.2 million quote-unquote irregular migrants, or illegal, the media calls them illegal migrants, we call them irregular migrants, between January and October this year. And on that question of illegal versus irregular, I think that a lot of us scholars who work on this say a human being can't be illegal. That is a status, that is a kind of a political stance that you take on someone, and so they're irregular migrants. They don't have legal status, but human beings are not illegal. So who's coming and who's applying for asylum? And you can see that, and I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A because I think this question of who's coming is why it's so politicized in Europe. And it's igniting these questions of, these are Muslims, this could be a terrorist threat. And I know that those are some of the questions that are probably people have about the U.S. and as it accepts refugees. So that's something that I think the origin of these refugees politicizes this question even more, and I'm happy to talk about why actually you would be really irrational if you try to use the refugee regime as a terrorist, because it is the most onerous, long, tiresome, difficult system of trying to travel. There are much more efficient ways if you want to get somewhere. So impact on Europe, who's coming, it's the identity of these individuals that's also politicizing the question. But on focusing on who's coming, what is Europe absorbing compared to the other immediate receiving regions. So just to put things in perspective, Turkey is by far the largest host for Syrian refugees, and I'm using again Syrian refugees in the colloquial term, over 2 million. Lebanon's hosting over 1 million. Jordan 600,000, which doesn't seem like a huge figure, but Jordan's population is really small. Egypt, Iraq. I mean, what we have to remember is that each one of these countries is stretched to their limits. Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt all had huge refugee populations predating the Syrian influx. Many, if not most of these refugee groups live in desperate conditions, and host countries can't meet their needs. Lebanon and Egypt's unemployment rates are in the double digits. Jordan is the fourth most water-stressed country in the world, that's even before the crisis, with insufficient potable water for its own people. Lebanon and Egypt, and now even Turkey this summer, have, well, Turkey less so, but extremely volatile political conditions, political environments, and unstable governments. Again, Turkey less so. But the Lebanese consider the Syrian conflict to already have crossed inside their territory, and fear another civil war is quite possible as a direct consequence if the war inside Syria is not halted soon. Turkey, the most stable host country, has already spent over $5 billion on assisting refugees from Syria, a figure equal to the entire EU contribution to the crisis thus far. And it cannot by itself actually indefinitely provide for the needs of the ever-growing refugee population coming over the border with Syria. And so I think that it's interesting because a lot of the debates have been about, oh, these are taxing European systems. So when you look at what does taxing mean, and you just take a look at what's going on in the surrounding area, and you don't need to be a security expert to realize that is extremely unstable. Having that kind of pressure cooker of people without opportunities who are stuck in refugee camps, that is where we worry about security threats. That's where we worry about radicalization, because you're not allowing people to go and live their lives, and you're allowing sort of smaller groups to organize, provide resources that can be a way of politicizing people. It can be around a different ideology. So I think it's really important to see, even when we talk about the security threats of Syria, I feel like most people look at sort of the horrendous acts of ISIS and these other groups that are just so showboaty in their desires to get this attention, but the greater security risk is actually the level of human displacement. That is a much bigger security risk. So less than 150,000 Syrians claimed asylum in Europe in 2004, and granted asylum in the United States about 1,557. And again, I'm giving you resources at the end of the lecture that you can use to look up some of these notes. Finally, taking a step back and thinking about this question of the refugee regime and who we protect. I think that the bottom line is that the entire system is put in place to protect people in response to a short-term political crisis of persecution. It's designed in that way specifically to distinguish between political crises and economic or other crises. The thing is, when you actually start to study why we produce these refugee crises, you can't disentangle those factors in that way. It doesn't make sense. Take the Syrian civil war. It was an Arab Spring popular uprising. That was the immediate cause. However, in order to understand why the uprising happened, you have to look at the decades of the patterns of privatization and economic growth, and we call this kind of crony capitalism. The way that Syria was privatized really privileged a minority of people, and you can't understand the political crisis without looking at those waves of policies and who they targeted and how they politicized identities within Syria. Actually, there's a great book by Bassam Haddad called Business Networks in Syria that I think really kind of lays this out very systematically if anyone's interested. Second, and actually, you know, I'm going to move to the third point with climate change. We think of unemployment as not being a reason for refugee status, we also don't really consider things like the impact of climate change on things like unemployment and economic crises, and therefore political crises. But it's huge. A lot of the flows that we're seeing out of Africa, so that other node into the Mediterranean, especially from Libya, are coming from destitute conditions that are deeply affected by climate change processes. You can't understand the Syrian war without looking at the fact that in the 5 years preceding the crisis, or the outbreak of the war, or the popular uprising, Syria experienced one of the worst ever droughts recorded in history, 5-year drought. Here's a picture of goats, trying to drink. So this led to mass upheaval. It led to people being forced to move to the cities, and a really high youth unemployment rates. Syria was looking at something like 48% of youth unemployment going into the crisis. So again, I think that we have this political system and legislative system, and make these arguments that these are refugees and not economic migrants. But really, when you start to look at things empirically, you realize you cannot separate those things. So what's the bottom line? I think the bottom line is that that's the deeper crisis. It's no chance. It's not like a contingent factor that we're looking at the worst levels of displacement in recorded history. The system itself is broken, and we have to produce something better. I think I'm going to end there and just show you some lesson plan resources. So the UNHCR databases are a great resource, and you can see all the quantitative material they amass, but also get really short summaries, which are useful if you want to talk about a specific case and want a quick update on it. There's a whole section called the Syria Response Plan that really goes into the Syrian case in particular and is very useful for data. The Office for Refugee Resettlement is also extremely useful. And then this I wrote, Vice Films documentaries for teachers, not really for younger students. I sometimes will occasionally show clips in my own class and think, oh, even with undergrad, some of the stuff in these documentaries is quite graphic, because this is a very difficult situation. And actually, I think that picture of the little boy sort of reminds you that it's very difficult to come to terms with the reality of what a lot of people in this world are going through, simply because they come from a part or a country where either they don't have opportunities, or actually it's not that they don't have opportunities, they come from a country where their passport doesn't give them global mobility. Because I think the difference is, we think that people weather economic crises the same way. They don't. It's highly mediated by what your passport is, and whether you can travel and leave and buy a ticket on a plane, or whether the only way out of your country is illegally because you just can't get a visa to go anywhere. There's one documentary in particular that might be of interest. It's called Europe or Die, and I mention it because I spent so much time on the Syrian case, and actually Libya and the African source of these migrants is really huge and important. And so that documentary looks at, one part of it looks at Libya, and it might be of interest. I will say it is difficult to watch, and especially when you look at what's going on with Libya, is that the Europeans are pressuring the central government, or the government, the makeshift government in Libya, to control all of the flows. And they basically, because the government doesn't have the capacity to actually enforce the borders, it's outsourced migration enforcement to rebel groups. So when you look at the conditions, effectively what happens is they just go out and capture anyone they see who's trying to go to Europe and hold them indefinitely. They don't feed the men. They separate the men, the women, and the children. So, I mean, and also one thing about refugee camps that makes them very dangerous, and that's why I think that actually allowing things to simmer in the way that they are is really unsustainable, is that we see that, especially for women and children, you're extremely vulnerable in those spaces, and rape is a systematic occurrence in these kinds of camps. Finally, one of my students showed me this website, Refugee, yesterday, and I was very impressed that you can just type in a word like refugees and get all of the databases and charts on refugees. I will say I started to play with it and found some data that was unreliable, but the website is more kind of like a Google for just databases, and then it's up to you to actually, you have to check the sources, because not all the sources are great, but some of them are, and it allows you to actually search across databases, the World Bank, UNHCR, et cetera, in a way that you can't do if you're only using one of them. So I think I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Laurie. If you don't mind, I'm actually going to hold off on Q&A right now. I want to transition over to Barbara, who will talk a little bit more about teaching resources and how do you talk about something that's so troubling and so powerful and you know, a crisis, maybe for lack of a better word, but talking about not just what's going on in Europe, but what's going on with all 60 million displaced people, whether they're in the Mediterranean region or elsewhere. How do you engage younger students in particular without scaring them, because some of these images and content itself is very powerful. So I'm going to transition over to Barbara, and Barb, feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you so much, Noora. That was really interesting for me as well to look at this broader perspective. And I think what I'll try and do over the next few minutes is to introduce a few ways to talk about what is really a very complicated issue. It's hard for students who may not have a very high level of geographic literacy. All those countries in Europe that they probably don't know where they are, all those countries in the Middle East and North Africa where they probably don't know where they are. It's hard to make sense of all of this that's going on a kind of global geographic level, on a political level, on a human level. So I think I'll look at some ways, some strategies that you can begin to approach this in your classroom. And I think a lot of them, while they may be focused on Syrian refugees coming to Europe, for example, will still be useful approaches that you can use for any aspect of this. So I think the first thing is to try and figure out how can you give students a kind of basic background. Now, some of the resources that I'm showing here might be a little bit old. I'm not sure whether all of them are being updated all the time, but they do illustrate 3 different ways that I think are really useful to get students to really be able to understand this in a way that's a little bit more complex. And that is to break things down from simple text-based resources and to look, the first one here, the BBC's Migrant Crisis Explained in Graphics, uses infographics to break down where the refugees are coming from, where they are in the Middle East, how they're moving, what countries they're coming to, et cetera, et cetera. So breaking it down and looking at the data in a graphical format, I think makes it easier for a lot of kids to comprehend. The second thing is an interactive timeline, which I believe the Huffington Post is keeping updated. It's interesting because it allows them to look at major news stories. So, for example, the young Kurdish boy who was discovered dead on the beach, that's one story, and you can sort of follow how much more frequent the news stories and the interest was after that point. So it kind of graphically shows, by tracking the media, how this crisis has developed in interesting kinds of ways. And then last is, and those of you who know me know that I'm a huge fan of maps because I think that we need that visual element. Really using a lot of different kinds of maps to get students used to where these places are and how movement is happening, I think is a really good way to get kids to kind of understand it a little bit better. So if you look at the UK's Wired, they have a really good set of maps that kind of show this. So those are three kind of graphically organized ways that I can think students can begin to get some of the background. The other thing is that I think we need to humanize the crisis. So rather than simply looking at it from literally a 30,000 or a 100,000 foot level by, looking at this map down on these kind of dehumanized blank places with arrows and borders that don't really show you much, the opposite direction, I think, is to look at some of these first-person accounts. And one of these, I have the same Europe or Die video. That one is probably on the graphic end, also very graphic, but very, very effective. And I don't know, if Josh, if you can put that one up. Khalid's, it's called A Perilous Journey. And this is actually, I think they've just posted yesterday the first of three. These are three mini graphic novels with a little bit of video and sound, and the rest are still graphic pictures featuring three different Syrian refugees and their different paths to Europe. The first one that's about this guy named Khalid. You see him in a refugee camp in Europe, in a refugee holding area center, thinking about why he is where he is, missing his family, and wondering what the future holds. And his experience is very graphic. I mean, he was taken by the regime and beaten and tortured. And so it is not certainly for middle school students. It may not be for many high school students, but there are some classrooms where certainly kids are seeing worse things on their own. But it might be interesting to look at the other two and see if they might be a little bit less graphic in terms of their experience with the regime, etc. Another one that I really think everyone should look at is this Clouds Over Sidra. It's a virtual reality film. That is, that the film has a number of different scenes, and in each scene you can turn around. You can turn the camera 360 degrees so that you can see everything that's happening around as people move in and out of the screen. And it's about a 12-year-old girl in a refugee camp in Jordan, Syrian girl. Very, very powerful. So there are a variety of first-person accounts that you can access. There are radio accounts. NPR did a number of those. And I think it's really powerful to let kids experience in the words or images taken by some of these people themselves what they've gone through to get to Europe and why they're doing this, to get them to imagine and to feel a little bit more empathy rather than simply looking at the statistics. And then I think it's important, I originally had done this just looking at these first two resources, which I think are terrific. One is by In a Nutshell. It's a terrific animated explanation of the European refugee crisis and the refugees from Syria. Very, very, very well done. But it's very also clearly coming from a political perspective that supports or advocates for supporting refugees, accepting more refugees into Europe and the United States, etc. Also, John Green. All of your students love John Green. He is, of course, famous for the crash courses and as a novelist and everything else. And he did a really good job explaining the Syrian refugee crisis. But again, from a very passionate perspective that we are not, in fact, doing enough to help these people. And it was pointed out to me that that was a little unbalanced. Okay, so I looked for arguments from the other side, and I think it's actually really interesting for students to see somebody like John Green passionately advocating for doing more for refugees, and then looking at some of the people like Dennis Prager who argue that Europe should not be accepting these refugees, that it is a danger to the identity of Europe, etc., and to let students weigh these different perspectives and make judgments themselves about who is making a more cogent argument. And as we'll see later, it also has resonance in the United States. So I looked at some American perspectives as well. I think that analyzing how Americans view what's happening in terms of whether they see this as something that's very significant for Americans, whether it's just a European problem or it's just a Middle Eastern problem, and the kind of arguments over, and of course in an election year, how politicized those arguments have become about what the United States' take on the refugees ought to be. One guy, Simon Reich, actually talked about the connections between gun control and the refugee crisis, and connecting it to other loaded political content in the United States. So I think it's really interesting to look at not just looking at this in its own context, but to look at it in terms of how it becomes politicized in the American political scene as well. So one of the things that I think that would be really interesting to do here is to look at how you can take the statistics or the data and get kids to actually think about how the data and how the statistics are used. As Noora was pointing out, the statistics that are used by different people on different sides of various debates can be quite different, right? The statistics and the numbers can be very politically loaded. So have students do some statistical detective work and look, where are these numbers the same? That different people are using? Where are the numbers different? What are the sources of those numbers? Why are they using numbers in particular ways? Have them think about what statistics they found to be the most moving or important or swayed their opinion the most and why they think that was. Have them think about what statistics they're not seeing that they would like to see that might make a difference in terms of how they think about this. And then think about it in groups or share around and have them compare what they think is important. You could, of course, also have students take some of that data and make infographics themselves. And then I think one thing that might be interesting is using those statistics and sort of thinking about, on the one hand, what might this look like if all of these people end up in Europe, for example, in 15 years, in 20 years, in 30 years? What does that look like for Europe? What does it look like for those societies, especially if trends continue? And then maybe even to extend it even further and think about, well, if this is a refugee crisis that's prompted by the war in Syria or instability in Libya, etc., think about what might happen in other hot spots in the region. So, for example, we know that Yemen, in the middle of a terrible war right now, but also is about to run out of water. So literally the capital of Yemen is about to run out of water entirely. So that's, I think, 10 or 12 million people. I could be wrong. I can't remember exactly. But all of those people will have to leave because there simply won't be any water. So Yemen would have a very difficult time absorbing those internally. So if you expect that a significant number of people would move from Yemen, where do they go? And so if you look at climate change as a factor, if you look at other conflicts as a factor, if you look at, dramatic environmental challenges in certain places, you can see that figuring out how to deal with very large flows of refugees can be very problematic, and you can look at similar kinds of issues in East and Southeast Asia. Then I think that it's really interesting to look at this whole issue of these migrants coming in and refugees coming in primarily from Muslim societies into Europe. The debate over the place of Muslims in Europe is a very old one. There have been Turkish guest workers in Germany for a very long time. There have been, of course, Algerians and Moroccans in France for a very long time, and debates over what that means for European nations' identities. And I think that it's really interesting to look at how the current crisis has sharpened that debate over whether Muslims can, should, want to integrate into European societies, or looking at them as potentially saving Europe from its demographic crisis, because of course Europe, in much the same way as Japan, is not, its population is falling, and its population is aging dramatically, and very soon it will be in a real crisis because it doesn't have enough young productive workers to sustain social benefits for an elderly population. So in some ways, this migration crisis could be a huge opportunity for Europe. On the other hand, there are people who argue that because these migrants are largely Muslim, they cannot integrate and they pose a security threat. So seeing that debate in a broader perspective, I think, will be really interesting for students, because they'll understand that it's not just about the rise in the numbers of refugees or people seeking refugee status over the last couple of years, but it's a much more long-standing issue. And of course, it's an issue or a set of issues that has enormous resonance and comparative value with issues in the United States. I mean, if we look at debates over the status of Muslims in the United States and what that's looked like over the past, 13, 15, 20 years, there's some very interesting parallels about what that debate looks like. Although in the United States, the Muslim population tends to be much more middle class or upper class and educated, whereas in Europe, Muslim immigrants tend to be less well educated and have fewer economic opportunities, at least to rise up through the socioeconomic spectrum. So it's really interesting to look at that. And similarly, you can look at debates in the United States over immigration and compare those to what's going on in the debates over the influx of migrants and refugees from the South in Europe. So I think that's a really useful comparative piece. And then, of course, it's important to look at refugee crises in historical perspective. This isn't the first time this has happened, and maybe we can understand this crisis better by looking at what previous refugee crises looked like at the time. So looking at primary sources from the period of, just after World War II, whether we're looking at Jewish migrants or other migrants within Europe, looking at the Vietnamese, quote-unquote, boat people, all of these and other incidences historically of large movements of refugees because of war, because of other crises, are really interesting parallels. And I think that it would be useful for students to think about what's the same and what's different. How much are the arguments about these movements of people similar to what happened earlier? And then I mentioned also below the last summer's debates over the unaccompanied minors coming from Central America, and looking at, for example, debates within religious communities about whether these people should be aided or whether they were, it was a threat culturally or to the safety and security of the people that they were their own society. So I think it's really interesting to compare the debates that way and have students really go deep on this issue. And then last, I thought I would just give a few options for action if students feel compelled to act. These are only a few of the places that are kind of gathering places. And of course, when students are interested in helping, I think it's really important to get them to think through how you decide what a reputable organization is, or how they spend their money, and whether they're effective, and whether sending money is the best thing you can do, or whether education is the best thing you can do, or whether you want to take a multi-pronged approach. So having students think through those possibilities, and whether it's about allowing people to tell their story, or whether it's about trying to find very concrete ways to help, or whether it's about political action in their own communities, that's an interesting debate for them to have about what effective aid or help looks like, what effective action looks like. And I think I will leave it there, and hopefully we've got some questions. I haven't had a chance to really look and see if we have any, but please do post any questions you have, and I'll step back and Noora and I can answer any questions, probably more Noora than I, but I'm happy to answer anything that people think I might be able to help with.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, we'd love to switch to Q&A now. Remember, you can submit questions by typing them into the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. I'll be moderating our discussion, and will do my best to get through as many questions as I can. Please also remember that while we welcome questions related to migrants and this current crisis, we do ask that you hold any questions you might have about other Middle Eastern issues for now. I'm actually going to invoke moderator's privilege and ask the first question. Professor Laurie, you've talked about, your conclusion was that we have these short-term regimes to handle crises like this, but nothing to handle long-term crises that we've seen for years and years, and probably we'll see for years to come. And what can we do to shift that, to solve that problem?
Yeah, great question, difficult question. I mean, I think that the problem is not just a legislative framework problem. The problem is a deeper economic problem, a structural economic problem, and we're seeing that income inequality globally is really, really skyrocketing. So a lot of this question of, what do we do has so much to do with how are different parts of the globe impacted by this economic crisis. And so actually real sort of structural change has to come from thinking about this economically. And I think I really enjoyed Barbara's talk and a bunch of resources that were useful. But one thing she said about just the way that is this an economic burden on certain states? I think that the deeper issue is how do we develop economic policies that allow for more inclusion kind of globally?
Thanks. I wanted to ask one more question before we switch over. This point about water, which you both raised, both in terms of Syria having just gone through and still going through a very long drought, and Yemen running out of water, which seems very imminent. I think both of you connected this to climate change, or at least Professor Laurie did. Not that I want to be making too many projections, but is this the beginning of something, or I should say this crisis the beginning of something that we're going to be seeing more and more and more of until we solve this water problem?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this idea of you as a state are responsible for the people in your immediate location just doesn't make sense when we look at the fact that economic policies and economic activities are always transnational and have huge impacts on different parts of the world. So your things that we do here actually can be part of the problem that's impacting people in these other countries, but because we think of responsibility and protection in terms of really territorial boundaries, we really have to rethink that part of the system. So I think that the question of are we going to see more and more of this? Absolutely, because it's just becoming more and more acute.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I think I would...
Go ahead, Barbara.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a little piece there. I think that if you look at projections, I mean, we all know that most of the people on the planet live relatively near to the ocean. And so when you have significant sea level rise, or when you have significant degradation of agricultural production, particularly in places where it's less industrialized, there's going to be, projections are for enormous challenges and displacement of people. And I think that Noora's absolutely right to point out that we have these weird nation-state blinders on, where we tend to see these things as much less of a problem if people are internally displaced than if they spill over these national borders, and I think that, and particularly only if they spill over regional borders. That is that frankly, we didn't pay a lot of attention to this crisis when it was only Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon that were dealing with the majority of the people were displaced from Syria, or when, you know, millions of people were displaced within Syria. And that perspective really has to change, because I don't think that the impact on people's lives are determined primarily by whether they're crossing over particular borders or not. It's a more fundamental issue, and I think that's, you know, I totally agree with Noora that the underlying causes and underlying solutions have to go beyond what you do when someone crosses a particular border.
Well, that actually leads us to a question that someone in our primary source viewing party had, and that's, why do we talk about the crisis from the EU perspective and not in terms of the U.S. responsibility? As you pointed out, Barbara, we have lots of people crossing borders, and yet much of the conversations that are happening within borders, or at least within an EU context. I was wondering if both of you could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Barbara, I can't make eye contact with you, so you should always feel free to jump in first. But just to take that, I think that, you know, on the one hand, you look at the figures, how many people need a home and how many people the U.S. is taking in, and you think, well, it could be doing a lot more. But to kind of show the other side, actually, the U.S. does do a lot through its funding to the UNHCR. It's by far the largest donor. So actually, even not directly through resettlement, but it does have an impact on assistance, a major impact on refugee assistance, and has had it. And actually wasn't even party to the convention in 1951. It only entered the Refugee Convention with the protocol in 1968. But it has historically and continues to be the largest donor by far. So in that sense, the U.S. is contributing. I think when it comes to actual physical resettlement, exactly the questions that Barbara raised are so important. And we were talking with someone from the State Department a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling us, I mean, we know that it takes almost 24 months to get asylum status, and it's the process is so securitized that actually you're more likely to have sort of the likelihood that you're going to be granted refugee status and actually be a threat is way less than the possibility that you will be denied refugee status because of the possibility that you could pose a threat. So I think that those normative questions of whether these people, who are these people, and is their identity the reason for the threat? And I should say there's the quotas for resettlement get set by Congress, and then the administration is able to allocate. But there's a very small quota for all of the Middle East and South Asia. So within that quota, you have to absorb all the Syrians, all the Iraqis, all the Afghanis, and then people like the Rohingya from Burma. So it's a really wide array of people that have to be absorbed in a very kind of narrow quota.
And I would just, you know, reinforce that it's a very, very politicized issue. It's not only that it's securitized in terms of, you know, the vetting of people that goes on, but it's also a very hot political potato in election season, and people are very wary of that becoming something that can be used to beat them over the head on either side. So it becomes used and avoided in very interesting ways. So I think that's part of it, but I also think that Noora's point about countries who contribute financially as opposed to countries who necessarily resettle people, I mean, this is something that there's often an accusation that countries in the Gulf have not taken in large numbers of refugees, which is certainly true. I mean, they've taken some, but they have not taken very many. But they've also sent a lot of money to Jordan and Lebanon and to refugee to help refugees. They could do more. We could do more. But I think that there's some politicizing of and name calling and pointing of fingers about who's doing what for political points rather than for actual effectiveness.
I'm glad Barbara mentioned the Gulf, and I'd actually like to address it, but I don't want to hijack if there's another question. Maybe if a question comes up about the Gulf's relationship to the refugee crisis, I would be happy to address that.
We do have other questions, but I think this is really important, particularly given your personal experiences, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Okay, great. Well, I'll try to be brief. I think actually comparing the Gulf and Europe is very powerful, and I'm really glad that Barbara brought it up, because I think when it comes to this identity crisis or the cultural threat, we always assume that the cultural threat is going to come from people who are more quote-unquote culturally different. And I think that if you look at the experience with the Gulf, why is it not a refugee resettling location? You have to look at the history of the Gulf War in the 1990s, and the fact that the people who became politicized were other Arabs, and the fears and protections were against sort of other Arabs, and part of it was, especially with the first Gulf War when Iraq occupied Kuwait, after the occupation, there were large populations of Palestinians, Yemenis, Iraqis who became basically enemies of the state overnight because their governments were seen as allying with the aggressor. So that led to a lot of forced displacement of especially Palestinians who were in Kuwait, and actually just a more general politicization of the refugee question in particular. So the strategy for countries like the UAE is a huge donor to the UNHCR. The Kuwait is a huge donor to the UNHCR, and they're not parties to the convention. They don't resettle, and actually the UAE in particular does things like it operates refugee camps in Jordan, but in general the tactic has been to throw money at the issue rather than physically resettling people. And going back again to this question of security, but in this case the security threat is coming from other, like culturally similar people. So it just shows you that it's really about what's getting politicized rather than this sort of idea that we have that culture is something that can be measured and having a space and time that you could kind of measure across distance. We noticed that even in other contexts, whether you're talking about Europe or the United States, different populations become their identities politicized at different times. So, the Irish, quote unquote, had to become white. With migration, this question of cultural difference, it's easier to think that that's natural when you're looking at Muslims versus, Christians or Europeans versus Middle Easterners. But those were very similar to debates to how early flows of guest workers from, for example, Portugal and Italy were treated in France and Germany. So we have to look at those parallels.
Thank you so much. I want to shift the conversation towards teaching a little bit more at this point. Layla asked a great question. She asked, how do we as teachers, educators, go about answering students who ask us about our own political opinions as teachers regarding what's going on? She's asking us the perspective of someone who is Middle Eastern herself, but I can see how this would apply to any teacher regardless of ethnic or cultural background. A lot of people have strong opinions. Some students may have strong opinions as well. And how do we balance that, both as teachers and as facilitators of discussion?
Let me start that discussion a little bit, and then Noora, I'd love to hear your perspective. For me, this is a really hard nut to crack because my sense is that I want to share and be honest about what my beliefs are and share them so that students can understand where I'm coming from and be able to, contradict me or argue with me or take on those things as long as I'm being fair about the kinds of things that I'm presenting. That being said, I don't think that that's always really feasible. I think that your weight as a teacher can drown out other opinions. I think that it can politicize the classroom space in ways that are not healthy. I think after, I've struggled with this for a very long time, and I really think that it's important to say that I want to hold my beliefs closer to my chest, and I will share with you what many people in my, in my professional space, in my academic space, in my cultural space, etc., are thinking. These are the kinds of ranges of opinions that I come across. But what our goal is to get students to think and to form their own judgments based on evidence. And it's very difficult to figure out how to do that, and for students to figure out how to do that if the teacher has a very strong opinion and they feel, however much you may say that that's not going to happen, they may feel that they're penalized if they don't share that opinion, especially if you have a student who is penalized because they didn't do the work or they don't understand and they didn't do well on the exam, but they can accuse you of having reacted unfavorably to them because they don't share your political opinion. I think that particularly when you're working on the Middle East, it is politically very dicey to share your opinions. And of course, what your school district and what your administrators and what your parents are like. But I would recommend erring on the side of getting students to form their own opinions without laying all your cards on the table, for very practical reasons, as well as for pedagogical reasons. That's just my 2 cents. I don't think you should hide that you have opinions, but I think you should be really upfront that, look, my job is to help you guys figure out your opinions and make your judgments, not to sway you with mine.
Yeah, that was great, Barbara. Thank you. And actually, I was going to say, I think that the way that you guys are all talking about teaching, and especially when Barbara was showing how staging debates and having resources for staging debates, I think that that's really what I've tried to do as well, is to say, look, you come in here and you want a textbook. There's no textbook because there are different literatures and arguments. And so let's take one argument. The one we take is authoritarianism in the Middle East, like as a broad argument, and then we go through all of the alternative explanations, cultural arguments, economic arguments, and I force them, and then they start to say, oh, but it's not one of these factors. So it forces them to start thinking about what evidence is captured in this argument. How does the person capture this evidence? Is it reliable? And once you start looking at measurement, how are we measuring a Muslim society? Is it just the number of Muslim people, or are we actually looking, is the author actually looking at whether the institutions are Muslim? And then you realize, oh, actually you're just counting people. This changes how we evaluate the evidence about whether you can generalize about this case. So I think that this question of bringing in multiple perspectives from very early on and not creating this expectation of the textbook, the truth, is really critical. But I think that, this is it's a real challenge for those of us who teach Middle East politics. I, for example, in my intro to Middle East politics, very strategically and very willfully teach around the Israeli-Palestinian issue because it's so politicized that I can't get students to engage productively. So instead, I focus it mostly on the political economy of the broader Middle East, and we kind of tackle the region thematically. We look at those cases within the broader region, but we don't spend too much time. And even with doing that, there was actually a situation a few days ago where student sort of disagreement on that particular issue, they fought in the classroom. It was after class, but I was quite shocked to realize that there were students in the class who didn't see eye to eye, because in the classroom you don't see that. They're very respectful. So I think that these are really contentious issues, but there are ways of managing those emotions. And I think that even when I present, I always present what I think, but I don't present, for me, I feel like it's not just an opinion. It's an argument based on data and evidence that I find compelling. And it's up to them to agree with me or to, I also show them why other arguments are compelling and try to present them in their best way with the best data to support that particular argument. And then let students choose, and I never penalize them for choosing one or the other. I just want them to be able to show why that argument is compelling and provide the evidence.
Thank you both. That's great. I actually want to draw everyone's attention to a resource that Deborah Cunningham, my colleague, posted in the chat box. It's a New York Review of Books article she was telling me about earlier today, and this answers Wendy's question, or could answer Wendy's question about a single resource that kind of lays it all out there. I know it kind of goes over the crisis so far quickly, what we know about it, and with regards to Europe, what different European countries are doing or have done so far. I actually want to wrap up, but before we go, I want to ask both Professor Laurie and Barbara for final take-home thoughts. Kind of wrapping up everything you've talked about, whether about the situation itself or about teaching, what are the key points that we really need to know and think about as we move forward?
I think I would say that, you know, when we teach about headline issues, I would advocate for not teaching them as just headline issues. I think you need to get up above and look at the context more broadly and figure out what skills you're teaching by teaching that particular issue, what broader contexts are you teaching that are going to be relevant as that particular story develops or as another story comes up, so that it's not, you know, crisis of the week, but you're looking at broader themes. I think somebody asked, you know, is there any hopeful thing that you can talk about or teach about when you're thinking about issues like the refugee crisis? And I think that while I'm not necessarily going to say you can find optimistic, you know, outcomes or whatever, you can find ways to think about privileging, you know, individual stories of refugees who've made it and who are moving on with their lives in productive ways. Or you can look at, you know, how might the refugee crisis in Europe help to solve Europe's longer-term demographic problem. So that I think that there are ways of contextualizing the headlines in broader ways that really give students more insight about larger historical and political processes.
Yeah, I mean, actually, just kind of building off on that and picking up on something that Barbara really emphasized with her resources was, I think putting the human face first is really important. And actually, the way you can relate to another 16-year-old who has to live in a tent with his entire family, that can resonate with a teenager much more than the numbers or the figures. And I think that then when we get to the micro level and the individual level, we realize that really the key question becomes documents and legal status. And these categories don't really, these clean categories between, well, these guys are illegal migrants versus these guys are poor refugees and vulnerable and should be accepted, whereas those should be deported or withheld. That's not really a clean distinction, and that becomes really clear when you're looking at the individual level.
Thank you so much to both of you, Professor Laurie and Barbara, for your time and thoughts today. Just to wrap up, remember tonight's webinar has been recorded and we'll be posting the video to our YouTube channel very soon. We'll also be emailing you the link to the recording along with links to all the resources you've seen here tonight. You should receive this email sometime next week after the recording has been processed. Of course, please feel free to share these resources and the link to this webinar with your colleagues. In the meantime, I encourage you to keep in touch with us by following us on Facebook, Pinterest, and Twitter. We actually do have a refugee crisis Pinterest board that has lots of teachers for research, resources for teachers interested in learning more about this topic and bringing some of these resources and activities to their classrooms. We also share a variety of teaching resources and PD opportunities in global studies, not just about the crisis, but the rest of the world. multiple times a day through these channels. They're a great way to get resources. And you can also learn more about upcoming webinars and courses and find other teaching resources on our website, including our very exciting upcoming study tour to Spain and Morocco. So on that note, thank you again, Professor Laurie and Barbara, for speaking with us tonight, and thank you to everyone who attended. I hope you have a great evening, everyone.